Hello everybody, it's Mr. Philip Campbell, and this is lecture number 10 in my honors course series for my class Modern American History 1865 to 2000. And today, talking about the 1970s in this week's class, and wanted to discuss the historic trip of President Nixon to China in 1972, its rationale, and the outcomes of that visit, which really are still with us today. The one of the core elements of President Nixon's foreign policy was the concept of détente. What is détente? Well, détente is a French word and is generally taken to mean a relaxation or an easing of tension. And this refers to the Cold War. Remember, back in 1961, the United States and the USSR had come to the brink of war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was probably the closest we ever came to a war with Russia. And going into the 70s, Nixon had advocated this idea of lessening tension with the Soviets to kind of step us back from the brink so that we didn't have to be on edge about possible nuclear annihilation continuously. So in the context of the Cold War, then, détente means the easing of tensions through measured cooperation with the Soviets, cooperation with them, but still in a general, larger spirit of rivalry. Essentially, Nixon wanted to shift the relational dynamic between the USSR and the USA from that of deadly enemies to something more akin to like the rivalry that two sports teams would have. Like they're enemies, but there's still, they're enemies in a sense, but there's still measured cooperation. They're playing by the same rules, essentially. So, for example, in 1969 in Helsinki, the USSR and the USA agreed to the SALT I Treaty. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or Limitation Talks. And the SALT Treaty established that there would be no more intercontinental ballistic missiles made unless an equal number were first dismantled or destroyed. And this ended up greatly reducing the number of ICBMs. These are the missiles that could be shot from one continent to another, nuclear warheads. Ever since the 40s and 50s, the USA and the USSR had been proliferating ICBMs. This was the first step towards reducing the multiplication of intercontinental nuclear warheads. A key strategy of Nixon's détente approach was China. Now, throughout China had become communist in 1949. Throughout the 50s and the 60s, China under Chairman Mao Zedong had an uneasy alliance with the USSR. So there was one giant communist bloc in Eastern Europe, even larger if you included North Korea, North Vietnam in that bloc. China had an alliance with Russia, but it was very uneasy. The Soviet-style communism was very different than the kind of communism envisioned by Mao Zedong. The Soviets and the Chinese communists did not always get along, and there was mutual hostility between them. And so China was a pivotal point in Nixon's détente strategy. And so in 1972, Nixon's going to visit China. And this is very important just for opening up relations between the United States and China. The United States had had no communication or diplomatic relationship with China since 1949, when the communists took over and drove out the nationalist government, which went into exile in Taiwan. When Nixon took over the presidency in 1969, his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, suggested that a key part of his global détente strategy would be establishing formal relations with China. And so Kissinger did some behind-the-scenes work, reaching out to the Chinese to set up the meeting. And in July 1971, President Nixon shocked the world by announcing that he was going to travel to China. No United States president had ever been to the People's Republic of China. It was a week-long visit from February 21st to 28th in 1972, and it was covered extensively by the press. Americans were fascinated by this visit. It was the first time that Americans had any images of China for over 2 decades. Nixon had a sit-down discussion with Chairman Mao Zedong, who was by that time elderly and very close to death. And he also had more substantial talks with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, in which the Chinese laid out their hopes, their aspirations for a diplomatic relationship with the United States, and helped Nixon and Kissinger to really see how we could move closer with the Chinese and how this could be used to our advantage in the global Cold War. So diplomatically, it was a success. And what were the diplomatic effects of the Chinese visit? Well, most importantly, it drove a wedge between China and the USSR. There was already a lot of tension between the two, but when the U.S. opened formal diplomatic relations with China and entered into diplomatic agreements with China, this really made it clear that China and Russia were no longer going to be an alliance, and it drove a wedge between the two. And when Russia realized that it didn't have China to depend on anymore in the Cold War, it really forced Russia to soften its tone and to come to the table and make concessions to the United States. It also helped drive a wedge between China and North Vietnam, because the Chinese had been in various ways giving support to the North Vietnamese Communist government in Hanoi throughout the Vietnam War. And what this did was it drove a wedge between China and North Vietnam. And so China and Russia, too, began to think that their relationships with the United States were more important than whether or not they were going to support North Vietnam. So North Vietnam became more isolated. Now, the United States also agreed to vacate our troops from Taiwan. Taiwan, the island off the coast of China, had been home to the Chinese nationalist government in exile since the late 40s. And the United States had supported this as the legitimate government of China, but the U.S. basically withdrew our troops that we'd been maintaining in Taiwan. And that was the bone we threw to the Chinese. So this was the beginning of our diplomatic relations with China. China, of course, would go on to be our most important trading partner in the world after the 70s. The response to Nixon's visit to China was overwhelmingly positive. Kissinger and Nixon had every move choreographed, every stop planned. It was well polished and rehearsed for maximum media impact. And it was very, very popular. In fact, to this day, there's a saying, Nixon going to China, or Nixon goes to China. This saying refers to a situation where a hardliner takes steps towards making peace with an enemy. If you reach out to make peace with an enemy, that's called Nixon going to China. So the agreements reached in 1972 became the basis of Chinese-American relations that are still in effect even to this day. It helped break up the alliance between China and the Soviet Union, which forced the Soviets to come to the table, make more concessions, move détente along further, easing the tension between the United States and the communist countries. Now, of course, one unintended side effect of this was that the Americans and the Chinese opened this trade relationship, and over time, Chinese trade is going to eventually dominate the American markets, where now our country is flooded with Chinese goods, junk. So if you're wondering why all our stuff is Chinese, it's an unintended consequence of the opening of diplomatic relations with China in 1972. But overall, it was a very positive thing for the United States and a diplomatic victory for President Nixon. Let's fast forward a little bit now to the end of the 70s, to the summer of 1979. What were things like in the United States in July of 1979? Well, due to the second energy crisis of the decade, there was long lines stretching for blocks at gas stations. There was rampant inflation with prices rising, and there was severe unemployment in the country. And the unemployment plus the inflation was a condition economists refer to as stagflation. So things were not good in the United States. President Carter addressed the nation on July 14th, 1979, and he mentioned these various problems, the energy crisis, inflation, economy, etc. But he In what has been known his Malaise speech, he went on to identify the root of America's problems not as anything economic or political, but something that he called a crisis of confidence. And the way he described this is quote, a growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation, end quote. And then he went on to talk about what is essentially an existential crisis in the soul of America, that things like consumerism and materialism were rotting out the soul of the country. This was a really extraordinary speech for a president to be making. Upon rereading the speech, it sounds like something you would read from Pope St. John Paul II or a religious leader, certainly not a political leader like the President of the United States. He doesn't mention God or religious, he doesn't mention religious solutions or anything, but he's pointing out what is in Carter's mind an existential moral crisis, something in the heart of Americans. An existential crisis of the nation. What does it mean to be an American? And if you think about it, things had really changed for America since the 50s. In the 50s, there was a very stable, fixed idea of what it meant to be American, of what is the American dream, what is the American way, what do Americans look like, how do they talk, what do they do. There was a very unified social and material culture. Some would say that culture of the 50s was stifling and oppressive because it was so uniform. But even so, there was at least uniformity. But a lot had changed since the 50s. There was the civil rights movement, the chaos of the 1960s, the sexual revolution, the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, all these things that shook the stability of Americans, that left Americans shaken about our country's place in the world and what really were our own values. So Carter's speech, the Malaise speech, was an attempt to call Americans to self-reflection about our own values, to reflect on what does it mean to live the good life? What does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to pursue the American dream? And what are the real enduring civic values that a good American citizen should exemplify? And I think what Carter was trying to do was to shift America's problems from the economic and political onto the moral plane, perhaps in order to try to unify the country the way FDR did with his fireside chats during the Depression. Perhaps Carter viewed his own epoch as something akin to what America was facing in the 30s and fancied himself a new FDR. Hoping to unify the country with his talk. Perhaps he was trying to summon forth a spirit of civic sacrifice instead of Americans complaining and whining about the economy and the gas. Maybe he wanted to call to mind a spirit of sacrifice like the people made during World War II with the scrap drives and the rationing and that sort of thing. So it's a very unique speech in presidential history. Most of the time you don't see presidents addressing moral problems so acutely, and Carter had spent a lot of time soul-searching over the speech. He had invited the nation's community and religious leaders to a summit at Camp David to talk about the sense of malaise or depression in the country. He had spent 10 days in seclusion. He originally was going to give the speech on the 4th of July, 1979, but he canceled last minute and spent a further 10 days reflecting, soul-searching. The speech was very popular and well-received at first. The White House was flooded by calls of thanks for Carter pointing out the problems in America. And it's interesting why Americans would react positively to it. I mean, essentially, Carter was saying, our way of life needs to change. Materialism and consumerism are killing us, and we need to rethink what it means to be American. But I guess Americans aren't averse to being called to task about our lifestyle so long as something better is proposed, so long as we are called to a higher manner of living. However, despite the initial popularity of Carter's Malaise speech, he quickly lost the initiative because very quickly in the month following the speech, the Carter administration fell into turmoil as several senior administration officials were fired and there was a big shakeup in the cabinet. And Carter lost the initiative. It became clear that his White House was in chaos. Those of us living through the Trump years right now know what that feeling is like, that the White House administration is a mess. That was the sense people got from Carter. And it became clear that even if Carter was right in his assessment about America's sense of malaise, that he had no concrete solutions for it. And ultimately, Americans are very practical people. We can only tolerate moral exhortations when they don't really inconvenience us. But when they call for sacrifice, when they call us to reflect too deeply on existential questions, Americans tend to get frustrated and say, yeah, what about the economy? Where's the jobs? This happened to me myself when I was mayor of the city of Howell, where often I would try to address moral issues or talk about non-tangible, non-political factors relevant to the community's well-being, and people would kind of respond like, well, yeah, what's your policy though? Like, how are you gonna fix the street? You know, what are you gonna do about this and that? So Americans want practical solutions. And when it became clear that Carter didn't have the political capital to do any, or even the ideas of how to fix the problems, his speech has since then been more kind of laughed at, kind of like, yeah, you gave us this speech and you pointed your finger at a bunch of things and you didn't really have any ideas. People are just now in the almost the second decade of the 21st century revisiting Carter's speech more objectively. Carter is routinely listed as one of the worst presidents in American history. Perhaps that's deserved, perhaps it's not. But more importantly, was Carter right? I think he was. Reading the Malaise speech now in 2018, it was very insightful, very accurate about many of the problems of the modern world. Again, just like something out of John Paul II. It's like reading Laborum Exercens on human labor, or one of the social encyclicals. So I think Carter had some good ideas. The problem was people weren't ready to hear it from a president. They're more willing to listen to it from a pope or something like that. And Carter, of course, subsequently lost the election in 1980 to Ronald Reagan, who would move back to a much more inspire America in a very different way than Carter was trying to. Carter was perceived as just harping about how bad America was and how our values were wrong, whereas Reagan was like, no, America's great. We have great values, and it's morning again in America. We can be proud. And the interesting thing, from my viewpoint, both Reagan and Carter were correct. But anyhow, I could go on about this forever, but that's Carter's Malaise speech of July 1979.